And I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I can't help it. I think it comes back to the leaders that you have. If you have an organization full of leaders who see inherent value in other people, who don't see other people as widgets to be used to get something done, but see them as something bigger and more important than that. If your organization's full of leaders who have that worldview, then you're going to have an organization that values people. And so I think it's critical for any organization who wants to value people that they have leaders who value people.
I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organisation. Today, our guest is Tim Spiker. How are you doing, Tim?
Very well. Thank you, Judith. Happy to be here with you and with your listeners.
I'm glad you're here too. Tim, do you have a favourite genre of books?
Genre books. Well, because of the work that I do, the work I do is not for a check. It's a passion. So I love books on leadership.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Do you find it a little bit like a busman's holiday, that you're out and about and you see things and you can't help but see the leadership lesson in the thing you've just observed?
Of course. There's almost this game that you play, which is actually I had a friend of mine named Mark Sickman. He and I would be driving in a car, and we would say, okay, we'd spot something on the road, and we would say, make an analogy out of that. And so I'm always observing and always thinking. And it's not just for the sake of communication. Sometimes it really is that the lesson is right there in front of you. And so I'm always have my antennas up for those types of things.
You know what? I love that game, make analogy of that. I'm going to start playing that game and see what happens, because that sounds like a good game.
It is. It is. It challenges the mind.
So tell us a little bit more about you.
Well, about 23 years ago, I got invited to an open house for a marketing company.
Mm-hmm.
And I was getting ready to start graduate school, and I was pretty sure there was going to be a free meal there. And so I'm in. And when I got to this open house for the marketing company, I realized that, well, maybe it wasn't exactly as it had been marketed to me,
Right.
which is to say that it was actually a recruiting meeting for a pyramid scheme multi-level marketing organization. And I had taken a seat in the middle of the room. So when I realized what was going on, and also realized at the same time that I did not want to sell water purifiers to my family and friends, I had a choice to make. I was like, okay, do I shimmy my way out of the room and make a scene, or do I wait for the break? And I'm very thankful that I decided to wait for the break, because it wasn't long after that till they started talking about what does it mean to be an employee. And it was in that moment when the dark cloud of doom and gloom entered, and everybody spoke about how terrible it is to actually be led by somebody. It was in that moment that the course of my professional life shifted. I checked out. I didn't hear the rest of the presentation. The speaker up front became like Charlie Brown's teacher to me. I didn't hear another word, and I just thought, why is it that way? Why is being led somebody actually such a negative experience? And that night in that room launched me off on my passion to learn about leadership. So that's how I got started in this work. But you say, tell me a little bit about yourself. This is one of the major things about me, is because I'm so passionate about the topic, and that's what opened the door to me that night.
I love that. When I was sitting down to write my book, I was thinking about all the leaders that I knew that were good. And I was absolutely struck that I could count them on one hand. And I was like, this book needs to be written.
Well, yeah. And if you, and for many people, if they get past one finger on a hand, they're fortunate, unfortunately. So yeah, there's plenty of work for us all to do, not only out in the world, but also within ourselves.
And what do you think the future is like for leadership consultants, trainers, mentors, etc., when AI fully goes beyond human assistance to actually doing the work? You think there's going to be a job for us? Because there won't be as many in the workplace.
I don't think that human relationships are ever going to go away unless humans go away. So I think there's always going to be a space. However, there's going to be lots of opportunity for counterfeits. And so in as much as AI is absolutely stunning technology, the things that it can do are almost unfathomable. I don't see a world in which actual human beings are completely replaced. And so long as there are relationships in the world, whether that be at work or at home, there is going to be the need for leadership and leadership development.
Cool. So tell me about the who, not what principle. Is that your principle?
Well, I think the short answer to that is no. And the reason that I say no is because while it may have been a phrase that I created in order to communicate an idea, the core of what is behind it is not mine to own. It's just it would be like asking me, is gravity mine? Gravity's not mine. It's something that we all experience. So the phrase is meant to communicate an idea that we have all been living in, whether we're aware of it or not. And so the who, not what principle is rooted in research. I was working with some other colleagues in the leadership development space. We had a variety of assessments that our clients were going through, and they began to ask, are there any connections or correlations between personality, natural ability, and leadership performance? And so my colleague, Vanessa Kiley, she put her fingers to the keyboard. She used the SPSS software, and she didn't find any connections between personality, natural ability, and leadership performance. But what she did find by accident is that within our leadership 360, that there were just 2 of the 8 areas that we were measuring that were driving 77% of the variability on that one assessment. And so I'm going to save everybody 3 years because that's how long that I personally sat with this data, looking at it, asking myself, what does this mean? But at the end of the day, of the 8 areas of leadership, I realized one morning looking at a whiteboard that the 2 areas that were responsible for that big 77% of movement, they were different. They were actually about who you are as a person, where the other 6 were about what you do as a leader. And that's when it landed on me like a ton of bricks, that the truth about leadership is that 77% of our effectiveness comes from who we are, not what we do. And that's how the phrase, the who, not what principle, was born. But the truth of it has always been here and will always be here.
So you said that you used research to get to 77%. Is that you researched a number of companies? What was the research?
Yeah, no, we were bringing leaders to the west side of Pikes Peak, which is in Colorado, central United States, and we were putting them through a number of assessments. So I mentioned personality. There was a natural ability battery that we give, just to give some clarification for those who are assessment junkies. What I mean by natural abilities is, some people can look at a string of numbers and they'll remember 3 of them, and other people can look at a string of numbers and they'll remember 12 of them. So it was a variety of different natural abilities like that we were testing. But we had the Leadership 360 that people were coming and spending the week with us, and they would distribute this leadership assessment to the people who reported to them, to their peers, and to those that they reported to. So initially, the research was done with over 2,000 of those Leadership 360s. Eventually, as we reran the data, it came to over 20,000 data points. We had plenty of data to find statistically significant correlations at 2,000, but then when we had 10 times as much, obviously it's a richer data set. So as we took those 20,000 data points and ran the statistical analysis, that's when that 77% number jumped out at us.
Okay. It's quite reassuring for me to know that, because I've been talking about leadership being personal, and it's about who you are, what you do. You can't pull apart the who you are part. And it's nice to know that there's someone that's gone out there and actually put a figure to that. So that's quite good. In your book, you talk about me needing to be inwardly sound. What do you mean by that?
Well, the analogy that helps in this space is to think about a seagoing vessel that's
Hmm.
about to head out. And you're going to head out on a long journey. And you know that while you're at sea, if you're out there for any amount of time, you should expect to encounter some challenges. And so before you head out of port, you want to know one very important answer, and that is this vessel sound? Does it
Mm.
have, does the hull, does it have integrity? Is it screwed together well? So when the stresses of the journey hit it, it's not going to start to shimmy and work itself apart. That is a pretty close analogy to what does it mean to be inwardly sound? Am I the type of person that when the pressure comes, it starts to work me? Or am I so well constructed internally that I am able to take the beating from the wind of and the waves and be trusted, that the integrity within who I am as a person is similar to the integrity of the most sound vessel that you could ever put on the ocean. If we talk about being inwardly sound, it means being somebody who can be ultimately trusted because they're not trying to work out their insecurities on other people. They're not having boatloads of debilitating questions about whether or not they have purpose, about whether or not they have value to bring. They're able to stand and be stable and be a grounded force for other people. That's what we mean by inwardly sound.
Okay, I like that. Wonder how many people, how many leaders think about being inwardly sound. Do you think,
Well,
oh, sorry, go on.
no, I mean that's a great question, and I think part of the job of people like you and I is to help them do that, to understand just how critical something like being inwardly sound is. Because when you look out at the world and you look out at the things that are normally promoted in the leadership space, there is so much about the external things that are looked at. And we understand that ultimately, the endeavor of leadership is designed to produce a result, but it has to come from somewhere. And
Yeah.
so the privilege that you and I get is to help people pause, hopefully just for a few moments, to take a look inward, to understand that what's going on inside of us has a big impact on what gets produced outside of us. And so we need to take assessment, we need to make investment, we need to be conscious of these aspects of who we are.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. And I'm just pondering whether there is a misfit between what companies ask for from their leaders and what they actually need. So if you look at the measures that are out there in terms of leadership, they're all externally based on what people do with not much attention to how they do it. So there are companies out there, of course, that have competencies and, leadership behavioral toolkits and stuff like that. But they're not all of them are using those things to appraise people, recruit them, or discipline them to. So it's like all the when the objectives and the performance measures are all about what you do, with none of it on how you do, then you're not really. I'm just sort of externally processing. I guess it means that you're not really caring whether you have sound internal leaders or not, are you?
Well, I think ultimately the question that you're bringing up there is a really important one, that is, what are you really after? Because there's a reality that we can get results, especially in the business space, in a
Mm.
variety of ways, and it really depends. Am I looking at the short term or the long term? If I have a sizable organization and I want to shift what our balance sheet looks like in a few moments, I can lay off thousands of people in a moment, and in that snapshot of a moment things look very different and much more positive. But of course, and that's an exaggerated example, but we see that not in the super short term, but we see that when people they want to position themselves to sell, right? So what do? they cut the staff down as small as they possibly can so that it looks like the greatest return on assets, return on investment. And the question is, have they cut into bone? Have they cut into the future potential of the organization? There's a variety of different ways this can happen. It's not necessarily just in downsizing, but my point is there are ways in business to this maybe is a bit too harsh of a word, but there are ways to manipulate what the numbers look like. And that doesn't really get at the heart of, are we building capability within our organizations? Are we helping people grow and develop so they can produce more? And what does it mean to invest for the long haul? So all the things that we talk about in our work around leadership are about the long haul. Lots of things work to produce a number in the short term. But what about if you want to be an organization that is successful over decades? What if you're a leader individually who wants to be successful over decades? Then we have to look at more substantive things than just a number.
Yeah. In my book, I talk about when you've got a socialized maverick leader who has become disillusioned and chooses to leave, the impact that has within the organization. And I think that sometimes, quite often, organizations get so used to having that leader who has really strong engaged networks, smoothed the way for others, empowered people to grow, got rid of the bureaucracy, and are leading in a way that they take the hit when things go bad and give the credit to others when it goes good. The organization seems to feel that they don't need that person anymore because that person's not doing the work, because everybody else is doing the work, without really recognizing that that person is that linchpin. And then when they leave, they suddenly see an avalanche of other people, not necessarily just in that team, but across the organization, leaving. And I just find it's a bit curious that even now organizations can be kind of very narrowly focused and blinkered as to what makes the organization work.
Well, I think that's a fair assessment, and it doesn't happen with all organizations.
No, of course not.
But it's really interesting.
All the ones we
especially-
work with.
Well, yeah. But when you think about the world of investment, when you think about raising capital, when you think about stock markets, and when you think about the way that boards work, it's really challenging in the publicly traded space. Now, I'm not suggesting that privately held companies have it made in the shade. They have their own set of challenges, but the public space, public organizations, publicly traded institutions have really challenging dynamics because the expectation is that that growth would be here and that it would be here now. And so it's incredibly challenging to lead in those environments. And sometimes you have leaders who are extremely well-grounded, people who others would want to follow through a fire. And if they're working with a board that doesn't understand the longer view and the truer definitions of leadership, they might not value some of the dips that happen in almost every organization. They might look to the leader and say, hey, leader, you're responsible for this dip over the last 6 months or over the last year and a half. And so, we're going to let you go. We know that CEO tenure is remarkably short. And so the idea is, yes, of course, over time, we as leaders, if we're leading well, should lead to a result. And then in that space, it would be a financial result. But the way that boards look at that balance between short-term results and long-term investment becomes really important in terms of how are they going to understand really the way the leaders that they have lead. And sometimes those leaders decide they're going to move on because they're working with a board that doesn't get it. And it's occasional that, things change in terms of what happens in the organization. So that can happen for sure. And I think it's a big question around short-term versus long-term.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let's listen to a quick advert.
As a leader, you know that having a strong level of influence is essential to achieving your goals. But how do you know if you're truly making an impact? Take the How Influential Are You scorecard to get a clear picture of your current level of influence and identify areas for improvement. With personalised recommendations and valuable strategies, you'll be able to amplify your influence and make a real difference as a leader. Don't miss this opportunity to improve your leadership skills. Take the scorecard now at amplifyyourinfluence.scoreapp.com. Welcome back to the Maverick Paradox. This is the podcast for the pathologically curious.
So, Tim, in your book, you talk about leveraging the truth of who, not what. And before we go there, I'm just thinking of the who.
Mhm.
How can organizations truly value everybody's who as opposed to the ones that are deemed the most important ones?
Mm. Well, that's a really challenging question. And if I could, before we dive into that one, could I round out the other half of who that we haven't talked about yet?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So we touched on inwardly sound, but there's another part to the equation that makes up these who's that we actually want to follow. And that is the idea of somebody being others focused. See, this is the combination, as we talked about being sound previously, somebody that's grounded and can be really counted on, a port in a storm, if you will. But if you combine that with somebody whose primary objectives and focus is other people and not themselves, it's an amazing combination. And it's that combination that we're talking about when we talk about the who of leadership. Is this person both inwardly sound and others focused? And that is the combination that produces leadership gold. So with that as a background, let's come back to the question here. How do we value who? And you bring up an even bigger question, which is you're talking about not just in quote unquote the important people, but in everybody in the organization. And I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I can't help it. I think it comes back to the leaders that you have. If you have an organization full of leaders who see inherent value in other people, who don't see other people as widgets to be used to get something done, but see them as something bigger and more important than that. If your organization's full of leaders who have that worldview, then you're going to have an organization that values people. And so I think it's critical for any organization who wants to value people that they have leaders who value people.
That makes sense. But it becomes cultural, isn't it? So when I think about this whole 80-20 thing, where people say, 20% of your organization brings in 80% of the profit and whatnot. So it can become a numbers way. And I suppose for some, there's an argument that you don't have the time or the resources to empower 100% of the workforce. So therefore, is it more efficient for an organization to empower the 20% that count? Because there are a lot of books out there that will say that is the preferred way of doing it.
Yeah, well, I've never seen an organization, even exceptionally well-run ones, that make the same energy and financial commitments to every single person in the organization. They do tend to be weighted more towards the people who have the greatest responsibility. And at a certain level, when you think about that, if somebody who's sitting in a highly influential position is underdeveloped as a leader, that's going to have a disproportionately large impact on the organization. And it's true on the positive side as well. So there is some logic to that. The question, I think, ultimately, though, is are there opportunities for people who are not as high up in the organization for leadership development? And so do they, A, not go to zero at the front lines, and B, do they gradually increase, as opposed to the fact, and we see this in some organizations, there's almost nothing as you move down the chain of command until you get to a pretty, high mid-level to senior leader executive, and then all kinds of stuff comes in. I think a more gradual approach will be of greater value to an organization so that they can begin to develop the leadership talent within the organization. But some organizations have trouble saying, oh, we're going to invest even in smaller amounts at our frontline leadership to begin to hone that. And the interesting reality of that, if you think about a manufacturing environment, your shift managers lead more people in the organization than anybody else collectively.
Yeah.
Individually, maybe they have a handful of people, but that position leads more people than anybody in the organization. So at a certain level, I would say it's crazy not to invest in leadership development with your frontline leaders. They lead more people than anybody else, and they're almost always, well, they are always closer to the actual interaction with clients and products than everybody else. So I'm not just suggesting on an individual basis the companies should or are going to invest enormous sums of money in every single one of their frontline leaders. But when they look at the sum total of what they're investing in those frontline leaders, if there's nothing there, then the number one leadership by volume position in the organization is being completely neglected. And that is something to pay attention to.
Totally. So we're certainly seeing it in this company, in the Maverick Paradox, in the sense that we do a lot of senior leadership training and development. But we're also doing a lot of management skills stuff, and they're completely different, and there are different price points and different emphases. But I think what you're saying is true, is that your high end customer is still meeting your younger or less experienced manager, or the impact of that management. So you could end up actually losing a lot of money and market share through poor customer service, for example.
Well, yes. I mean, you want to begin investment ideally, and not all organizations do this, but ideally you want to begin in leadership development before somebody's in the leadership role.
Yeah.
Not even wait until they land there, because at that point, now we get to screw people up as leaders. And so let's not wait until we have that power. Let's begin leadership development before people even sit in those seats. And of course, there's if the cynic is listening, they would say, well, of course you believe that, Tim. You work in leadership development. And what I would say to that is, I don't have this perspective that I have because of the job that I do. I have the job I do because of the perspective. What I mean is I see those truths, and it draws me to want to do the work that I do. This isn't a sales pitch. I'm drawn to this because it's true. I mean, just think about the math of it when you think about frontline leadership. I'm not advocating for more leadership development so that people will hire me. I'm drawn to leadership development because I see the need. And so that's what I would say to the cynic. And I understand the cynic. I'm a bit of a skeptic myself. I'm always asking questions. Tell me more about that. Give me the numbers behind that. So I actually connect with that line of thinking. And yet, if we're going to be intellectually honest, we have to hold open the possibilities that, it could turn out that something that the other person's passionate about, like leadership, actually does have a need. And so I do think it's important that organizations invest not the same amounts of time and energy and money in everybody, because that's not possible. It's also somewhat not rational. But to get to zero at our frontline leaders also makes no sense at all to me.
Yeah, and it's the other side of it as well, isn't it? Because there can be an assumption that very senior teams don't need any development because they've taken the development they needed to get to the point where they are.
I've seen there are organizations that believe that. There are individuals that believe that. I was working with an organization at one point, and who we were going to begin the effort with at the top of the organization was a discussion point. And one of the executives literally said, yeah, I've done all that leadership stuff. I don't need to do that. And to have a closed off perspective on your own growth, and then now maybe what was going to happen in that organization wasn't something that person was interested in. The blanket statement, I've done all that, I don't need to do anymore, is a sad commentary when we see it in the executive suite or anywhere else.
Well, especially now, because almost certainly the development that they've had in the past was in a stable environment, not in the post-COVID, everything's changing every second of the day environment, which requires new skills and development. So just before we finish, I'm not sure you answered the question about leveraging the who, or did you?
No, I didn't. You're right. So let's get back to that. It's very important. Thank you for bringing that up. I think if you're going to invest in leadership development, if you're going to want to grow an organization that is full of leaders across the board we can't ignore the who. We can't ignore inwardly sound and others focused. And so ultimately, what are the elements that need to be present, that have to be present in what I would call who-based development? And there's three things that I believe that we have seen with our clients that are absolutely a must in order to leverage who into more well-developed spaces for leaders across the organization. And it's encapsulated by three letters, DCT. The D stands for depth. We cannot be satisfied with leadership development conversations and curriculum that live at the surface of behaviors. Behavior is essentially a lagging indicator of what's going on inside. And so if we're going to do who-based development well, we have to pick up that rock of behavior and look underneath to see perspective, to see motive, to see worldview. And we have to be open to the fact that when we pick up those rocks for ourselves and others, that we might see some things that aren't very, very pretty. And that's okay. That's part of developing as a human being. And so it's critical in who-based development to have depth. The C in DCT stands for community. Find that people grow and develop in greater depth and in greater quality and even in greater speed when they're doing it alongside in relationship with other people. We tend to do our development based on a small group of 3 to 4. And what we find is people walk together through the process. There's a few things that happen. Number one, there's accountability to follow through on the activities. Number two, there's the opportunity for me to look at somebody else's story and learn from it. And number three, there's the opportunity for somebody to see my story and speak into it. And all of that makes this flywheel of development go better and faster at the same time. So community is a really important part we find in the who-based leadership development effort. The final one is T, and it's the one that nobody likes. And if I could wave a magic wand and change it, I would. But the T stands for time. We live in a world where we've got, as we've been talking about, we've got generative AI and we've had microwaves forever. And we just want everything. And Amazon's going to deliver something with a drone to my door in about 30 minutes. You know, it's just the technology of the world is moving faster and faster and faster. And while there are things that we are learning around human development that can help us move that more quickly, it's never going to be a microwave. It is almost always, and I say almost because there are a few exceptions where somebody might encounter a tragedy in a moment that changes them in an instant, but that is extraordinarily rare. What is normally our path towards development at the inner core of who we are is step by step by step, over time, over time, over time. And so we need consistent effort over time to grow and develop in who we are. So these are the three elements. If we're going to take the who, not what principle research into effect in our leadership development, I think the thing that comes alongside that to leverage the reality of who, not what are these three aspects of development: depth, community, and time.
Fantastic. That's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Tim, for coming on the show.
Judith, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And thank you out there for tuning in to the Maverick Paradox podcast. I am your host, Judith Germain, and I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation.
The Maverick Paradox Magazine. The Maverick Paradox Magazine is for the pathologically curious. Written by a swagger of socialized mavericks who are divergent thinkers, the magazine tackles the biggest issues affecting maverick leaders today. You might be a business owner or a leader within an organization who wants to have your thinking challenged, to be exposed to a diversity of thought, or to learn from diverse experts in their fields. If so, the Maverick Paradox Magazine is for you. Join the swagger at themaverickparadox.com and engage in the conversation.